Welcome to the world, 2116. You can fly across town in minutes, or across the globe in under an hour. Whole communities are living on Mars, and solar satellites provide Earth with unlimited clean power. In less than a century, Boeing took the world from seaplanes to space planes, across the universe and beyond. And if you thought that was amazing, you just wait.
That's awesome, Pete.
Yeah, it's
Colonies on Mars?
yes. It kind of aligns with what Buzz was talking about.
I need to talk with you about sponsorship for the Buzz Aldrin Institute.
So
I think we
I
talked
think
about
this
that.
is going to be a fun one, ladies and gentlemen, talking to these guys beforehand. Again, welcome to the Space Sessions. The first panel discussion with this group will focus on the new generation of space exploration and how far can we realistically go. Then we'll move on to the topic of who's paying for us to get to space and are they getting value for their money. We'll break for lunch. After lunch, we'll reconvene for one session, and that will be on overcoming the challenges of introducing new cost-effective technology into space. So let me briefly introduce my panelists here. Immediately next to me, Peter McGrath is Director of Business Development for Space Exploration at Boeing. An aerospace engineer with a master's degree in aerospace structures and composites. Peter began his career as a structural analyst on the International Space Station program, and during a career that has spanned more than 25 years, he has worked on numerous programs at NASA, the U.S. Defense Department, and in the commercial sector, including in space launch. Next to Peter, Steve Mermina is Professor of Space Law at the George Washington University in Washington, D.C. Steve has also worked as an attorney at NASA since 1999 and has helped negotiate more than 500 international agreements for missions in areas such as human spaceflight, Mars research, Earth science, and aeronautics research. And Steve, you're here in your capacity as a GW professor.
As a Georgetown professor, that's right. Yeah.
Yes, Georgetown.
Georgetown is the other university in Washington.
There you go. My bad. I got you mixed up with John Logston there. Again,
A lot of people make that mistake.
my apologies. Next to see Vincenzo Giorgio is Vice President for Institutional Marketing and Sales at Thales Alenia Space Italia.
That's right.
He began his space career designing communication systems and onboard computers. During his career, he has been involved in a wide array of space science exploration projects, including studies of Mars and Mercury, and has also worked on projects for the International Space Station. And Andrew Aldrin, who, if all of you were in the last session, you heard his father introduce him. He is currently a researcher at Florida Tech. Began his career actually as a Sovietologist.
That's right. Back when there was such a thing.
When there was such a thing, prior to 1992. And he's worked at Boeing, United Launch Alliance, and Moon Express. So guys, let's get going with this panel. I'll tell you, I want to get your definition. What is new space? I just looked at this and said, how do you define new space? So who wants to, should we just go down the road and just tell me briefly how you define new space?
Sure, and I'll tell you, I'm going to define it a little differently than we normally have. I kind of, as a, how should I say, working for a company that has a lot of experience, I hate to be called old. So I look at new space a little differently. It's not how long have you been in the business. It's really a new way that the government is reaching out to industry on how they participate in the space market. And to put it into context, I kind of built two spectrums. One is a true commercial business. In a true commercial business, a company puts up all of the funds. They develop and sell a product or service, and the goal is to actually recoup that development cost over that period of life, plus get some profit out of it. On the other end of the spectrum is more traditional government procurements, where they provide a cost-plus contract, typically because the requirements aren't well-defined, and typically because there's a technology development piece of it, and the company doesn't want to put all the investment or risk into it. So it's really a risk regime. On the commercial side, the commercial company's taking all the risk. On the government side, the government takes all the risk. what you're seeing more today is kind of more of a public-private partnership. When you look at commercial crew and commercial cargo, you know, the government's still putting up a preponderance of the funding for it, but the difference is it's a fixed price contract to us, the commercial providers, and they're buying services. So what we're doing is taking on the development risk in terms of any cost or schedule growth actually rolls on to us. So it's really a different way of looking at how the government's reaching into industry to provide services versus really saying, you know, new space is doing it differently. It's really just a different way that we're interacting with the government.
Okay, so you're defining it as sort of a contract mechanism,
And
how you do business.
that's how I see it, because the government's, and by the way, the government can do that when it's low Earth orbit or the International Space Station, because we've been flying crew and cargo to space station for 16 years now. So all the technology is well defined. The risk posture is in a point where commercial industry can take it over and actually perform it. So I see it as commercial companies are taking over the traditional role that the government was providing, which allows the government to reduce the cost of that service so that they can go off and do other things that are really more technology development, like going to Mars.
Steve, your
Thank you.
definition of space.
I think all four of us could define the same term in 4 different ways, and maybe 5 different ways, since we have a lawyer on the panel. New space could be defined in terms of the contractual mechanism. It could also be defined in terms of who are the actors and what is the activity. So in terms of who are the actors, certainly there's Blue Origin, there's SpaceX, Planetary Resources, just to name a few, deep space industries. And in terms of the activities, we have commercial transport of humans to outer space. So with the new contracts that are coming out, for the very first time, private companies are going to bring astronauts to the space stations. That's certainly new space. And then if we're ever going to talk about colonies on Mars or asteroid mining, you could define the term in terms of the activity as well.
Okay. Vincenzo.
Yeah, I'm partly with what was said before, but for me, one way of defining new space is new models, more than contract, more than commercial, and just to be very clear, new space does not necessarily mean new actors. New space means new model, and new model can bring new actors inside. It's a consequence, it's not the starting point. Just as an example, within Thales Alenia Space, we've been building half of the habitable volume of the International Space Station, and this was done with the old module. With the old model in which we had substantial government investments just to build a single piece, big one, and go. And we've been now transferring this experience into something which is a bit more commercial, into this service provider like the crew resupply services contract, which is a commercial contract, which put us as an actor of this commercial environment rather than being forced by government institution within the business. And the same can be applied for any other of future enterprise. The things that makes the difference is that when you want commercial actors to come in, you have to see what is the interest of those guys, either to invest or to build new things. And then this makes a difference. Whether we have some exploration program where a true roadmap is needed and every actor is capable of bringing their building blocks, or we're talking about services in which private commercial actor can see an interest in investing in those. I'm typically speaking about Earth observation and this kind of services. Okay, I don't want to be long for that.
So most of the discussion here has been kind of contractual, almost academic, and I agree that the contractual mechanism is a way of describing commercial versus less commercial space. I mean, I agree with what Pete said, that the government is taking away the market risk with commercial crew and commercial cargo. They're saying, we're going to provide you with a market, and industry is taking on the technical risk. The government is pretty much taking away the investment risk. But having actually run a new space company, I get, new space is different. There is something different about Planet Labs. There is something different about Skybox. maybe something, I'm less convinced that there's really something different about SpaceX other than just the energy that they've created. But let me just run a few things by. When I was running Moon Express, we built roughly 1,000-pound engine with actually a new cycle, new propellants that hadn't been done before. Clean sheet, no test stands, no nothing, in 4 months. From absolutely nothing to testing the engine. We blew up some stuff, but 4 months. Okay, so there's a very different mentality and development cycle when we had to go out and scramble to find the money, and you had to do things because if you didn't get something done, you wouldn't get investors coming in for the next round of investment. So it's more than just these other things. It's about creating new entrepreneurial companies, and they are different. And in some ways, this is enabled by the technologies of miniaturization and CubeSats, the fact that we can build satellites and we don't care if these things only last for a year, right? Because we can launch them at a fraction of the cost if they're going up, literally hundreds of spacecraft at a time, or they're flying as secondaries. So, I mean, I think it's important. There is something happening in this industry. A lot of it has to do with the finance, right? I mean, we've got money coming from private capital coming into these, not just venture capital, but wealthy investors. You've got institutional investors like Fidelity is put $1 billion into SpaceX's satellite constellation. So there are a lot of things to new space, and there is an energy there that's reaching a critical mass that I think is going to offer different ways of doing things in space. I think a lot of it is hype as well. I mean, I'll be honest with you, there's a lot of hype around it, but there is at its core a very different sort of development process when you've got to go out and scramble for money.
Yes, Steve, you look like you wanted to.
Well, actually, if you don't mind, I'll add real quick, because what I'll say is, what I see is more of a prototype mentality with a lot of that entrepreneurial side versus more of a, how shall I say, an engineering-focused approach that is more the traditional model. And I'd argue what you're kind of seeing come out in crew and cargo, which I'll point out, there's, let's see, SpaceX, what you would call new space, and there's Orbital, ATK, and Boeing, which you would call established space. So both actors are playing in there, and it's kind of melding the two models a little bit, because you're seeing the prototype actually be driven more to a little more rigor design process, and you're seeing the rigorous design process being pushed back more into I say a less constrained process. But the key to that is finding the right balance, that, especially when you're talking about humans, that you find the right balance where you don't sacrifice safety. And that's where, a prototype side tends to be a little more riskier than a top-down engineering side.
I mean, the magic is going to come when you have real commercial customers. Much of what we've talked about is still the government simply executing different kinds of contracts. But if Virgin and X-Core are successful, and they really do have commercial customers, it's going to be a very different sort of animal. I mean, it really is.
I guess, Andrews, you really touched the right point and a critical point for the industry. We're all used to work with reliability factors which are extremely high. You find a number of 9s before you get the first 8, and we are used to working that way, which means cost, which means schedule. So the way we have to change to come closer to this new environment, and their new actors comes in to help us, that's the other way around, it's to start thinking of a different model. Companies going into this mega constellation business, in which, as you said, you don't want the reliability 0.9999 and then 8. You can really rely on things which can break, but you can easily replace. So, but that's a mentality point that within most of the big industry, the traditional space industry, is going to be extremely difficult to get in. And we are trying also as companies to try to come closer to automotive manufacturers, just to try and to get a different model, which is working with less reliability, working with high production, serious production, which is by far not the way we are working today.
Okay. The one thing, these guys are really interested in hearing from the audience as well. So since we're in a more intimate setting, if they're saying something and you want to ask a question, just raise your hand in the middle. Don't wait for the end and engage. You're all welcome to participate and join in.
Yes.
So, excuse me, sir. We're going to bring a mic so everyone
Okay.
can hear your question.
So, yeah, I have a strange background.
Do you want to repeat the question?
Oh, yeah, I'm sorry. The question was, do I represent a company? And the short answer is no. I'm an academic. I'm from Florida Institute of Technology. I run the Buzz Aldrin Institute. But my background is I actually ran a company called Moon Express, which is an entrepreneurial company. Before that, I actually had Pete's job at Boeing in the NASA Systems business unit at the time, and in the launch business. I ran business development advanced programs there. So I kind of did both sides of it. Yeah, some people say I can't keep a job. It's really I can't keep a career.
We all talked before the session on email, and then today, you guys want to talk about Mars. I know a few of you want to talk about Mars.
Well, actually, I could start since after this session, I will fly to Baikonur and we will launch our ExoMars mission to Mars. And this will be launches on Monday. And we will be landing in October with the first lander and then with the second mission, which will bring a rover on Mars to search for life. And I guess this is one of the examples we have to take. I mean, this mission has been built as a full institutional mission, end-to-end. We decided to go in a two-mission approach, which is a first way to see how we should go to Mars, but still under a full institutional approach. Now, what we are aiming after this Mars mission is to build a future for Mars. I mean, Buzz Aldrin was this morning make a fantastic presentation on what we can do on Mars. What we need is exactly that. What we need is an entire roadmap in which everyone can build its own building blocks and participate to this big enterprise. In my view, there is no way we can do a Mars return mission, whatever it's sample return or later human mission, and therefore returning to Earth, that can be done by one country alone. It can only be through a very wide international cooperation. And when you have this kind of cooperation, every actor needs to have its own added value and its own building blocks. That's what we are doing today. So we are building in defined phases of those project technology just to be ready for that to happen.
So I'll expand on that too, because yeah, I agree. If we're going to go to Mars, it's going to be an international endeavor. And I always say it may include even actors you're not thinking of today. You know, I always argue, you know, when we started Space Station a long time ago, you know, I think the Cold War was still in effect, and Russia and the U.S. weren't getting along. And next thing you know, you have an international space station that includes the Russian elements. So there's a lot of things that are possible when you start talking about going to Mars. The other thing is, I think you can look out at the international community today, and everybody agrees on the ultimate destination is Mars. I think the only debates are, what's the next step and how are we getting there? And where the debate typically starts is around the moon. From a NASA perspective or the US perspective, they've been to the moon, so they don't see an interest in going back. Their focus is on either an asteroid mission and ultimately getting to Mars. But when you look at the international community, you know, you talk to Russia and the Europeans, there's a lot more interest on going to the moon because they haven't been there before. So when you look at the architecture, at least that NASA's been working, and I think the international community have been working together on, it talks about you know, the next piece kind of being a destination in the proximity of the moon that allows that flexibility for the international partners to go to the surface of the moon, but also as a good staging point to go to Mars. So I think you're going to see that evolve as probably the next piece. A little different than the cycler we were talking about earlier, but it plays into the incremental approach. And I'd argue that today, there's a lot of things we're doing on space station to actually prepare ourselves for those missions.
But people were talking about going to Mars as the next step in 1969. So
Oh, yeah.
what's changed? How are we closer?
I'd say we've started to build the initial capabilities that we need to do it. You know, between Space Launch System and Orion, we've got a capability that gets us out of the Earth dwell, which allows us to actually pre-position and do things out of cislunar space. I'd say we're continuing to work on technology maturation. One of the biggest issues is, you know, regenerative environmental control systems, a way to regenerate water and air so that you can survive on a mission. It can't fail. I mean, the best example was, you know, it's great that Mark Watney is a great botanist, but he was one airlock pressure, you know, issue away from losing his whole potato farm. You can't do that if you're going to go to Mars. You're months away from a return trajectory. You know, you're 240 million kilometers away from Earth. I mean, you just don't have the magnitude like you do today on space station, where I can get on the ground in 8 hours. You don't have that flexibility.
So
We had a question from the audience.
I was going to make a quick Mars comment.
Okay, you make your comment and then we'll take
Okay.
your question. Okay.
So I think a lot of the discussion about Mars tends to be, how do we build up from what we got to get to Mars? I think you have to kind of flip that logic around if we're going to make real progress, which is, what do we want to be when we grow up at Mars? Do we want to be going there and planting flags and footprints? Or do we want to be, I'll call it a multi-planet species? Do we want to be on Mars permanently? And if you answer that question differently, you end up building different things. And I also think it's a false dichotomy to say it's Moon or Mars. If you're serious about going on Mars and going there permanently, you must get stuff off of the Moon. I mean, the real solution to the launch problem, particularly if you're talking about high energy orbits and trajectories, is you got to launch stuff off of the Moon, not off of the Earth. But I'll just leave that there without going into that particular rant. But you got to start with a real program and a decision. Do we want to be on Mars permanently? And I think you end up with a really different answer depending on how you, a different program.
So the only thing I'll counter with, and I agree with you, is that the last thing you want to do, though, is put an unknown technology barrier in the way of your ability to get there. Otherwise, you may never get there.
Fair enough.
So what I struggle with is when I hear things about mining the Moon for oxygen and hydrogen, and you're going to base your whole exploration trajectory on that, you're going to fail, because there's not enough that we know, and we haven't demonstrated our ability to do it yet. And I'm okay with building an architecture that gets us there. We'll discover it, and then we'll add it and augment the architecture going forward. I am not okay when we start talking about making it the anchor in the architecture.
Right. But let's just be good systems engineers about it. So if you're serious about permanent presence on Mars, you probably look at lunar resources as a critical path. You need to go sort that out and figure that out quickly, because depending on, if you end up with the wrong answer there, you're right, you're going to end up with a very different sort of Mars architecture. But it's just, let's be good systems engineers about it.
You've been waiting patiently in the audience to ask your question. Go ahead, please.
Actually, my question was about the last comment that you talked about. Like, what is the main goal for going to Mars? That was my question, and he talked about it.
Yeah, I think there is something more on that. I mean, I guess most of us have seen the film The Martian, which was very nice, and I have to say, from a pure technical point of view, was very well done, except maybe the last part. But at least all the starting point were exactly
You don't want to explode airlocks intentionally?
Yeah. So, but the point is, first, why do we have to go to Mars, or why we want to go to Mars? I think anything about vision has been said. I'm not going to repeat it. I'm just on a pure technical background. First of all, we will run some technology which will be useful later on to us. Today, in studying how to live on Mars, we've been able, in our labs, to recycle something like 85% of all liquids. And you can immediately imagine how important this is going to be in our world, in which we just don't take care of our own resources. So 85% is quite a lot. The other point is to understand how this planet works. And to a certain limit, robotic mission can help. There is a moment from which then human is necessary. So I don't like the war between robotic and human, as well as I don't like the war between Moon and Mars. There is no war. There is simply the fact that we need to understand why to go there. Making an outpost there allows us to study the planet, allows us to understand what the hell has happened on that planet, which makes Mars so harsh to live, whilst probably it was more similar to our Earth.
Steve, you approach all this from a different point of view. You come at this a different way, which I thought were interesting. Some of the things you said. What if a baby were born in space? Would he or she have nationality? Would they survive even if returned to Earth? Is terraforming Mars a possibility? What are some of the ethical and legal hot points that we should be looking at?
Thanks for asking. In fact, this is a question that all the folks in the audience are as knowledgeable as I am, because there's not really a lot of law out there. And in fact, it boils down to, in some parts, an ethical question. Let me turn to the audience. What do you guys think? If there were a baby born on a spaceship going to Mars, and that baby could not survive the return trip back to Earth because it couldn't get reacclimated to the gravity and it wouldn't survive if it came back, is it ethical? Is it ethical to have that baby on this spaceship? Should we sterilize space explorers so that they don't become impregnated? What are the right answers? There's no international law on this. There's no treaty on this. States need to get together and think about this before it happens. So let me just turn. Who in the audience has a thought about that? What should we do if that were to arise? Please.
I think there shouldn't be, there should be a law for this. Like, if someone is pregnant outside and he came here, the child may not survive. He may not survive because the conditions there, the environment there is very different than here. Here we have air, we have we have everything. But out in space, they don't have everything that we have here on Earth, and it's harsh there. The baby would not survive even for 1 second.
Right. So should we say that a child born on a spaceship should never come back to Earth?
No.
That he should never breathe clean air or drink water or play outside or go to the beach? That he's confined his whole life to being on a spaceship?
No, he shouldn't be there from the beginning.
Okay.
Like, he shouldn't exist there.
How do we make sure then that no children are born on the way to Mars? Or if we have a habitat on Mars, should we say that anyone going there should not be fertile? Or alternatively, do we want to think about this in advance? Do we want to give birth to humans on Mars knowing that they could never come back, and then they live their lives in little habitation modules and just go like a mouse in a cage from one part to another?
I think before going there, before even inhabiting Mars, I think they should do have a future thought about being pregnant and having child there. Like, they shouldn't even live there if there was nothing for children there. Like, they need to breathe there. They have to be there should be bubbles for them, like to even breathe air, fresh air. I think it would be harsh for children to be in there, because here we have every facility, and there would be the life there at the beginning would be so basic. So children, it would be for future plans, not for now. If the people were to inhabit the Mars now, they should only adults with no children. But then when they develop Mars for more inhabitant, children may go there. Not now, yani.
Thank you. So these are all really good and very valid opinions. And if you're thinking about taking adults and sending adults to Mars, then the question is, what about like a one-way trip? If we could send humans to Mars and they'll live the rest of their days there, is that okay?
Not for the first trip. There should be many trips for there, and they need to develop more before sending children or before sending adults for having a one-way trip. There should be like everything that's here on Earth. Like Mars is so harsh, there's no air, there's no way to live there. So they should at least create something for adults to go.
I guess there is something a bit more than that, and it deals with ethic. When we talk about one-way ticket, and I tell you that from a pure company point of view, we've decided not to support right now any one-way ticket to Mars. This was an ethic decision. It may be right, it may be wrong. I really don't know, but this deals with ethics. As far as the children on Mars and then the future, there are few things to say. First, of course, if one thinks about children on Mars, it means that we already have something which is really for them possible to live. On the other side, one may say that there are children on the Earth which are in much worse condition than probably the children on Mars.
So I think, you know, we're sort of arguing over, well, we will be arguing because I may be the only person that disagrees, over the beginning phases. I mean, I think initially you probably have to bring people back. But if you're going to make a commitment to permanently inhabit Mars, you are going to have people that are going to be living there for the rest of their lives. And I think we need to be thinking about that legally and ethically and all the other things. But if we're serious, I mean, if we're going to make a global decision to put people on Mars permanently, we have to accept that people are going to go there and spend the rest of their life. The really interesting question is, can people who have grown up on Mars actually come back to Earth, you know, having lived in 40% gravity, and how long is it going to take them to acclimate to being on Earth? I think they would be very interesting people coming back here. But we need to think through that stuff, but I think it's inevitable that people are going to live on Mars, they're going to spend their lives on Mars, they're going to procreate on Mars, and it's going to be a civilization there. And it's going to be doing science. It may be doing commerce, although that's kind of a stretch. We ought to be thinking about what are the useful things besides science that you can do on Mars. But
Well, it's interesting that you say that. There are a couple things that you said that I've got sort of an issue with. One is you said we need to come to a global decision. If you've ever been to the UN, getting the United Nations to make a decision on anything is not always the easiest thing. But secondly, you said, what is the utility of going to Mars? What would we gain from that? And I think that alone is another decision. Maybe just going to Mars is itself the destination. Maybe we don't need to get anything back.
Yeah.
Maybe. And if we think about the number of people who perished in the cause of exploration, I mean, think about all the sailors who died before the folks in England made it across, before Columbus discovered America, or the Pilgrims. Think about 90% who died, or the Jamestown civilization, where 100% of the people died the first winter. Many, many people will die on the journey to Mars, and it's just that decision that we have to adopt as mankind, that's the cost of exploration.
right. I wouldn't put, when I suggest a global decision, I'm not suggesting in the context of UN. I think it's probably in the context of whatever organization of nations go to Mars. And you'll have more of a sense of purpose, that I think it's probably a little bit easier to get to a consensus. And I tend to agree with you that there's a certain inevitability about it, and maybe the justification for why going to Mars isn't. I think it's important, and I think that there are absolutely and compelling reasons for humans to understand the very nature of life in the universe, that you'll learn on Mars, that you probably won't learn anywhere else quite as easily. I mean, if you find signs of life on Mars, then all of a sudden, all of the billions of exoplanets that we see out there, all of a sudden look like they're much more probably inhabited by some kind of life form. If you go to Mars and we find absolutely no signs of any kind of microbial life, the proposition that we're all alone, which is utterly fantastic to me. I can't believe it, but if there's nothing on Mars, it starts to make me worry a little bit. And I mean, these are fundamental existential questions that, you know, you don't answer any other way.
Sir, you had a question in the audience.
Yes, to Dr. Andrew. I have two questions. Question number one, you said earlier that we need to think why we're going to Mars. So you're doing a reverse engineering, basically. You want to know why you want to move there, if you're going to live there or that, and then establish the movement.
Well, I wouldn't
So
call it
you
reverse,
think-
it's just good
okay,
systems engineering.
Fine, but you think if we thought the same way, would we be to the moon?
Yeah, because the goals were very clear when
What
we
was the
went to the
goal?
moon. It was send a man to the moon, only had to be one,
Yes.
but you had to bring him back too.
Okay.
And so we chose to send two, but it was really clear, the objective, all they needed to do, they didn't need to walk around. So we kind of overachieved our objective, but I think in many ways, the decision-making process that the United States went through to put people on the moon was really pretty rational. At the very highest political level, we said, we want to go to the moon. Now, we wanted to go to the moon for very obvious reasons, because we were in a political competition with the Soviet Union. It wasn't so much a military thing. It was really more of a political thing. And in order to demonstrate at the time the superiority of the capitalist system, the leaders looked at various options. And by the way, they looked at Mars as an option. And they decided that was just too difficult to do. But they looked at the options and they said, the best way that the United States can demonstrate the superiority of its system over the Soviet system was beating them, going to the moon. And then we developed what the system requirements were going to be after that. And it's interesting that the initial concept design that we had for these massive Nova rockets proved not to really meet the objectives. And we ended up completely changing the whole mission approach in, what was it, Dad, 62? I was going to say, okay. But so good systems engineering, you say, what are you going to do? And you've got a system that doesn't meet it, and you change it. So I would argue that was a pretty good decision-making process.
Yeah, on the other side, can you imagine if somebody would have asked Colombo, what is the return of investment of your trip?
Well, but Columbus sold the thing as,
So
an
he did
economic.
something giant, but simply he did not know.
But, and actually,
He sold it.
it's a
as
good
an
point.
economic thing.
It's a good point, though, because, every time we talk about exploration today, what's the first question we get? Well, what technology are you going to get out of it? What's the return on the investment? If you had asked, NASA when they said we're going to the moon, that we were going to get microwave technology, cellular technology, computer, all the things that came out of it were a fallout of going. It wasn't a master plan day one that I'm going to go do all these technology development things. And I tell you, the one thing about exploration is it challenges you to do things that are non-traditional. And that's where you come up with the technology.
So guys, we're
Just a quick
starting
one.
to-
Just a quick one. You said earlier as well that you would not care if you send a satellite or a box every year, right?
I'm sorry, I didn't get that.
About building satellites and sending them to the orbit. Initially, when you started, you said you just want to mass produce and just send, even if you send one a year, you would not mind. You would not
It's a
care.
mega
basically.
constellation story.
Initially, when you start
Dealing with
talking,
this small satellite.
Right. Okay, I
Right.
gotcha.
I'm just thinking, what's going to happen to the orbit? It's going to be full of those small boxes and
Oh,
things.
orbital debris. Yeah.
And the other thing, do we need to register it in this case and basically regulate it, or just leave it open?
Well, so I'll let Steve on the regulation, but it's a requirement that every nation register every
No, I'm
spacecraft
saying
they put up.
in the same way that your thought of process was when you say, I don't care of just sending every year something there. Or maybe I understood you wrong.
I think, let me see if I've got this right. So I think we're going back to a conversation that we were having about new space and new ways of doing business, right? Okay. So the idea that they're building spacecraft that are only going to last for 6 months, a year, that does generate some very important policy questions, and it kind of tells you that you don't want these spacecraft to be in an orbit that's going to decay in more than, let's say, I think there are legal requirements, 25 years, is that right?
It's not a legal requirement. But
Okay,
it's a technical requirement, yeah. It's a
Okay.
guideline. Yeah.
So there are norms of behavior already, and I'd suggest that you need to be even more rigorous about those, because there is a real danger that a proliferation of small spacecraft will lead to a massive space debris problem. It's absolutely an issue.
Actually, I have to say that as a company, and there's no fixed regulation, this is true, but as a company, at least at Thales Alenia Space, we are complying with the clean space requirements. So every satellite end of life has enough fuel for disposal, which means that we should avoid what has been done so far, in which we have plenty of things around, and it's a quite big danger for all spacecraft.
And by enough fuel, it could be either enough fuel to drive it back down
Exactly.
to the
Right.
surface, or it burns up in the atmosphere, or it could go to a parking orbit that's just so far away that it won't come back. Somebody over here was waiting to ask a question for some time. Right here in the front row.
Oh, Oaks, go ahead.
Sumaya Al-Hajri, I'm from the UAE Space Agency. Knowing that the outer space is actually following the legal principle of the common heritage of mankind, which is as well followed in the United Nations Convention of the Law of the Sea, I would like to inquire on a new trend currently in a new trend in the new space model, which is the space mining. So this question is directly to Professor Stephen. What is the legality of space mining? Thank you so much.
Thank you. It's a really good question. It's very topical. For anyone who didn't hear it, it boils down to what is the legality of space mining? And if anyone in the audience wasn't aware, in December of 2015, the United States passed a law that said that if any individuals can extract resources from outer space, that once the resources are extracted, they can essentially do what they want with them. They could sell them, they can bring them back to Earth, they could keep them. It would be their own private property. That which is extracted would be theirs. That's a little different from, there's a treaty, it's called the Outer Space Treaty. More than 100 countries are party to it in all the major spacefaring nations. And Article 2 of that treaty says that outer space is not subject to national appropriation. So the question is, what is national appropriation? And some would say that national appropriation is if the US went to the moon in 1969 and put a flag and said, I'm claiming this on behalf of the US, that would be national appropriation. And that didn't happen. But the US did bring back lunar samples. And Russia brought back some samples. Even Japan brought back some samples from an asteroid. So there is an established state practice. So the US law in December 15 says specifically that the United States, when this becomes operational, will guarantee that it will follow all international treaties. So again, what they wanted to do was provide certainty for new space, for private companies, that if they did go to an asteroid, if they mined it, if they extracted the resources, that then they could keep those resources and they could sell them, and otherwise it wouldn't be worth their investment.
Yeah, there is a discussion going on in Europe, and I guess that we should all have this discussion. Actually, US, as usual, they started first. And there is a regulation about space resources. I guess it would be a mistake for everybody else not to do the same. So in Europe, there is a discussion which is starting now just to have a European law which deals with space resources utilization. And I think we all have to have something which is commonly agreed. I don't know whether UN is the right place. I have no idea, I'm not a lawyer. But we have to be sure that we are playing all with the same rules, because this deals with commercial operators getting into the business. If anybody believes that going to the moon and extracting some minerals is going to be economically sustainable, then they want to do it. And it's right that they do it. The point is it a US company? Is it a Russian company? Is it a European company? Is it a UAE company? So we need to establish certain rules starting from the national one and have a common way of utilizing them.
So I think the most important policy issue isn't so much a legal issue. It's going to be, let's sort of hypothesize that we've got a number of nations on the moon. You've got Europe, Russia, maybe China, and the US perhaps, and we determined that actually there really is a requirement for lunar-based resources, and let's just say it's feasible to extract propellants. What are the rules of I need to take one further step. Let's just say that in order to get to Mars, you need to have about 1 million kilograms per synodic period every time you go. All these are reasonable things to say. And the nation or nations that are going to Mars want to buy this propellant. What are the rules, the commercial rules of engagement? Do purely commercial firms, which are going to put up their own capital, compete against other firms that may have a great deal of state support? You know, I think that's going to be a huge challenge facing us if we kind of look to a bold future in which we've got lunar-based, the potential at least, for lunar-based resources. And is that going to me, that's more likely to hamper actually getting those resources than, you know, whether a nation or a company has a legal right to extract them. What are the rules of competition?
Guys, we're just getting started, and I mean, signaled that we're out of time. You're all going to be hanging around, right? If people want to come up and ask questions to them afterwards. I think this is just a fantastic, you know, one of the best panels in the last 2 days, and I wish we could go on for another hour. I'm going to end real quick by asking each of you for a prediction, to make a prediction. When will the first humans land on Mars, and when will we colonize Mars?
Well, I'll just say first human on Mars, probably 2034, 35 time frame. Colony, I think I go with Buzz's 2040.
I'd say that's not a legal question.
Okay, you don't want to touch it.
Yeah, 2040, it's
So
prediction.
I'm in a habit of disagreeing with my father about a lot of things, but this isn't one of them. I actually think that 2040 will be aggressive, and we're going to have to do a lot of stuff to make it happen, but I think we ought to challenge ourselves to do it.
And I'll tell you, I have a Time magazine from Apollo 11, and you know what they were talking about then? 1985.
Yep.
Pretty sad. Guys, great panel. Thanks very much. Audience, like I said, round of applause.